What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about recycled biphobia, aphobia, and enbyphobia, and how to recognize it for what it is. There's some very harmful rhetoric that keeps getting rebranded and used again and again to attack different segments of the queer community. Haters just can't come up with anything original, I guess. So I want to break down the common threads between biphobia, aphobia, and enbyphobia to make it easier to spot as the tired, recycled, hateful load of BS that it is. Before I do that, I'm going to clarify what these different types of phobia are and which segments of the queer community are affected by them. First, we have biphobia, which is aimed at people who are attracted to more than one gender. So that includes people who are bi, pan, poly, omni, etc. You may have also heard the terms multisexual and multi-romantic for this community, or the much more general term bi-umbrella. Second, we have aphobia, which is aimed at a-spec people. Asexuals and aromantics, including gray aces and arrows, basically anyone who falls along the asexual or aromantic spectrums. And third, we have enbyphobia, which is aimed at non-binary people. Anyone whose gender falls outside the binary of being strictly a man or strictly a woman. So a huge umbrella that encompasses a ton of different genders or the lack thereof. I belong to all three of these groups. For the bi angle, I describe myself as technically bi but in a gay way, meaning that the tiny handful of people I occasionally develop romantic feelings for are either men or fellow masculine-leaning enbies. For the a-spec angle, I'm asexual and demi-romantic. And for the non-binary angle, I'm a trans-masculine enby. More specifically, I'm gender fluid, fluctuating in a space between masculine and genderqueer. And one thing I've noticed as a result of being part of the bi, a-spec, and non-binary communities is that there are very clear patterns in the type of hate that tends to get spewed at all three groups. I've seen some of the same comments over and over again with slightly different framing depending on which group the haters want to attack that day. So here are 5 of the most common ones. Number 1. That's not real. I first heard this aimed at the ace and arrow communities, both from straight allo folks, those who aren't a-spec, and in broader queer community spaces online. Awareness of a-spec communities has only recently begun to spread, and most of society still doesn't know that aces and arrows exist, so apparently that makes us seem less real to them. Also, there are far more allo people than a-spec people in the world, and many of them have a hard time wrapping their heads around the concept of not experiencing sexual and/or romantic attraction, so that also contributes to them thinking that a-spec orientations aren't real. But surprise, surprise, this rhetoric isn't just aimed at a-specs. Years before we were even talking about the ace and arrow spectrums the way we do now, people were saying this same kind of thing about those under the bi umbrella. That bi was just a made-up orientation for selfish people who wanted to have their cake and eat it too. And when we saw multi-attracted orientation terms evolve to include the label of pan, lots of people started claiming that was a made-up orientation too, or that bi was a good enough label on its own and we didn't need a new one. Side note, we did need a new one actually, because although bi and pan share a lot of overlap, there are distinctions between them that are very important to some people. By the time I started questioning my gender and realizing I was non-binary, I should have seen that that's not real rhetoric coming from a mile away. I mean, heck, even my own gut reaction to learning about non-binary people was, that sounds fake, but okay, because no one bothered to tell me that NBs existed until I was in my mid-20s. But of course, once I started meeting NBs, I discovered just how real they were, and that I was one of them. Unfortunately, not everyone has that same realization. You practically can't go online and enter into any kind of discussion about non-binary people without seeing someone complain that we're making it up. There's only 2 genders. God created man and woman. Anything else is faking it for attention. If you think you're non-binary, you're delusional and you need help. Need I go on? And this sadly happens within trans community circles just as much as it happens outside of them. There are an astonishing number of binary trans men and women who think that NBs aren't real or that we're not truly trans, which leads to claims that we're taking up space and resources from trans people who actually need them. And that makes it harder for us to access community, healthcare, mutual aid, all kinds of things. What really gets me about that's not real is the screamingly obvious double standard, because all human culture is socially constructed. So if you're going to claim that those under the bi, a-spec, or non-binary umbrellas are made up, why aren't you making the same claim about, let's say, straight people? What makes one socially constructed concept more legitimate than another? Also, just because something is socially constructed doesn't mean it's not real. People have experiences around their orientation or their gender and need a way to talk about them. The words we use to talk about them might be made up, and they might evolve over time as our understanding does, but the experiences we have are very real. Number 2, pick a side. This is another old argument against multi-attracted people that has been recycled and used against others over time. When used against the bi community, it's typically framed as, you can either be gay or straight, but not both. Pick one. This shows a basic lack of understanding about how bi, pan, and similar orientations work. Being attracted to more than one gender doesn't mean yo-yoing back and forth between being gay and straight until you eventually have to land on one. It's a whole different experience. But I guess that must have been just too much for a lot of monosexuals and monoromantics to wrap their heads around. For the a-spec community, the pick-a-side rhetoric manifests more as pick something, because surely you can't just go through life being attracted to no one. That would mean missing out on one of the core parts of the human experience. And for non-binary people, you guessed it, this argument is used to try to get us to pick a side between being a man or being a woman. And just like with that's not real, pick a side can come at us from both within and outside of the broader trans community. In most aspects of life, we're already forced into picking a side by the extremely limited gender options we're offered on everything from public bathroom doors to the markers on our driver's licenses. But one area where this can manifest in a particularly harmful way is with medical transition. Some providers have an understanding that's more up to date with the times, and realize that the old standard male to female or female to male transition isn't right for everyone. Heck, it's not always right even for binary trans people, much less non-binary ones. But other providers are stuck in the past and won't work with non-binary people to create a tailored transition plan that works for us, or will deny us gender-affirming healthcare altogether. And even if doctors don't do this, most insurance companies do. Whether you fall under the bi, a-spec, or non-binary umbrella, being told to pick a side really hurts, because it implies that society can't accept the complexity that is core to our identities. Instead, they want to simplify us into something that can easily be categorized. But that's just not who we are, or who any humans are, really. We're all complex beings, and we all deserve to have that recognized and respected. Number 3, you're just too scared to be gay or trans all the way. The first time I encountered this one was when I was questioning my gender. I saw lots of other NBs getting accused of being afraid to be fully trans or to make a complete transition, simply because the transition path they were taking wasn't a typical one. Maybe they only transitioned socially but not medically. Maybe they only had surgeries but not hormones, or vice versa. Maybe they changed their pronouns but not their names, etc. None of that constitutes a lesser or an incomplete transition or means that you're not fully trans. It's just a different way to go about it. But that's not what a surprising number of people, even in the trans community, seem to think. I later started seeing this same attitude crop up against a-spec people in the form of things like, these kids are too scared to admit that they're gay, so they come out as something safe like asexual first. And I say kids here because I have largely seen this aimed at younger a-spec people, adolescents and teens, many of whom are still in the process of questioning and figuring themselves out. It might also look something like, people only call themselves ace or aro because heteronormativity plus religious extremist views on sex and relationships have led them to believe that they can't be gay, so they'd rather say they're attracted to no one because they're scared to admit who they really are. And guess what? That same argument has been leveled against people under the bi umbrella too, for decades. The concept of political lesbianism is a good example of this. In the 1970s, many bi women were told that being with a man was a betrayal of their own gender, and that being gay, not bi, was the only way to be a true feminist. More recently, people have been told that they're only coming out as bi, pan, etc. because that's more socially acceptable than coming out as gay. Or that they can use any straight attraction they feel as a shield to hide behind to appear normal in society, unlike gay people. I've even had a few bi friends get told to their faces that they're really just gay and afraid to admit it. The common thread here is that bi umbrella and a-spec orientations are seen as a stepping stone to being fully gay, and non-binary genders are seen as a stepping stone to being fully trans, as if those identities aren't their own fully formed experiences. And while it is true that some people come out as non-binary and then later realize they're actually binary trans instead, it also happens the other way around. Some people come out as a binary trans man or woman first, only to later realize they're actually non-binary. And the same goes for orientations. Maybe you come out as bi or ace before realizing you're actually gay, or maybe you come out as gay before realizing that you're actually attracted to multiple genders or to no one. Any orientation or gender can be a stepping stone to another in the journey of figuring out who you are. Maybe you figure it out correctly on the first try, or maybe you start with one label and shift to another or more than one over time. Maybe it's not so much that your orientation or your gender actually changes, but that you gain a deeper and more nuanced understanding of it and end up using different words for it that fit better. Or maybe it actually does go through some kind of shift. But regardless, the important thing to remember is that there's no orientation or gender that solely exists to serve as a phase or a stepping stone to another one, and it's past time that people stopped acting like that's the case. Number 4. You're ruining the dating pool. I first heard this one leveled at aces from a source that felt like a real betrayal because he's an openly gay man and prominent voice within the queer community, and that's Dan Savage. In 2011, someone wrote into his Savage Love Advice column who self-described as minimally sexual, in a way that sounded a lot like gray asexuality, but this person likely hadn't encountered that term and didn't know what it was. Their question was about whether they could ever be accepted by a normally sexual person, or what we would describe as an allosexual person, in a relationship. And this part of Dan's response raised a lot of red flags for me. Why would you even contemplate inflicting yourself on a normally sexual person? Why not go find another minimally sexual person? You'll be doing all normally sexual persons everywhere a favor by removing 2 minimals, you and your future partner, from the dating pool. And as if that wasn't yikes enough, he also went on to add, I certainly hope you're not another asexual/minimally sexual person who wants a normally sexual partner because you take a perverse pleasure in depriving someone else of sex. In light of that, I guess it shouldn't have come as a shock to find that Dan also had this to say about bisexual men more than a decade before that in 1999. Sorry, but avoiding bi guys is a good rule of thumb for gay men looking for long-term relationships. Outside of San Francisco's alternate universe bisexual community, there aren't many bi guys who want or wind up in long-term same-sex relationships, monogamous or not. And this. There are definitely some people who should fool around with bisexual men, other bisexual men. Jesus Christ, bisexuals, if straights and gays treat you unfairly, then why not turn to each other for love and comfort? All of which implies that bi men are ruining the dating pool for gay men, just like aces are ruining the dating pool for allos, and those groups should just stick to dating amongst themselves. Fortunately, Dan's opinions on both the bi and a-spec umbrellas have evolved a lot since then, as evidenced in his 2021 interview with NPR about what's changed in the 30 years that he's been giving sex advice. I've linked that in the description in case you want to check it out. But the thoughts he expressed in past decades reflected commonly held attitudes from the time that multi-attracted people and a-spec people can't make good partners for anyone but others like us because of our orientations. And unlike Dan, many people haven't moved on from those attitudes today. A similar sentiment also affects the trans community on a widespread scale. Trans people, binary or non-binary, are largely perceived as undateable because our genders don't fit society's standard. But there's a specific way this affects non-binary people, which has to do with the way a lot of modern dating culture is structured. Many people date using apps these days, and if you're on one of those apps, you have to tell it, I want to show up in searches for people seeking men or seeking women. You might be able to list yourself as non-binary on your profile, but for the majority of these apps, there's no search option for people seeking NBs, so you have to include yourself with either men or women for the purposes of search results. And that leads to attitudes like non-binary people are ruining the dating pool because they're showing up in my searches for men or women. This is clearly a problem with the design of dating apps, not the existence of non-binary people. But even when we meet people the old-fashioned way, by chance encounters in person, we still run into this attitude a lot, because none of the advice or expectations or social scripts around dating take non-binary people into account. I personally despise the idea that anyone can ruin a dating pool for others simply by existing as themselves. Successful dating and relationship building involves finding compatible matches. That's done through good communication, not through blanket assumptions. For example, a-spec and allo orientations may seem fundamentally incompatible on the surface, but it really depends on the individuals in question. And there are plenty of successful a-spec and allo partnerships out there thanks to good communication. But if you don't want to do the work of that communication to determine your compatibility with a specific person, and instead you would rather exclude an entire group of people from your dating pool, then great, do that. No one is forcing you to date anyone you don't want to. But there's no reason to say that the groups you aren't interested in are ruining the dating pool for everyone else. Number 5. Cis-het passing people don't belong in the queer community. In my opinion, this is by far the worst bit of recycled bi, a, and enbyphobia out there. It's both extremely common and extremely toxic, and it results in a lot of queer people getting cut off from their own community and doubting whether they're really queer enough. I first encountered this one in the form of parallel arguments against multi-attracted people and a-spec people on various social media sites like Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. And it often looked something like, if you're ace or aro, you can pass as straight and therefore don't count as queer. Only homoromantic aces get to be part of the community. The rest of you can pass as straight, so you're not welcome. If you're bi or pan, you can come to Pride, but if you're in a straight passing relationship, don't bring your partner with you. For people who figure out they're bi or pan after they're already in a straight passing marriage, there's no point in coming out, etc. Statements like these are rooted in the idea of straight passing privilege, meaning that if you can pass as straight, you have societal advantages over other queer people who can't. I have another video about my issues with the way we frame the concept of passing privilege. One of the biggest ones being that passing as something you're not involves erasure of who you are, and erasure isn't privilege. On top of that, these kinds of statements about who really counts as queer make a lot of assumptions about the way multi-attracted people and a-spec people do or don't have relationships, and whether we even can be perceived as straight by straight people. I can tell you, I never felt less straight passing as an ace than when I was trying to shoehorn myself into a straight relationship, and that was before I even had the knowledge or the language to describe myself as ace. But I could still sense that there was some major fundamental difference between myself and my actually straight partner. So after seeing so much of this rhetoric used to gatekeep those under the bi and a-spec umbrellas from the wider queer community and exclude them from Pride events, I recognized it immediately when trolls started using it against me after I came out as non-binary. The first time this happened was when I made a post on Instagram about how dysphoric it made me to go to conferences for my job where I wasn't out yet, so I had to present as my assigned gender and be misgendered all day, only to have someone comment that at least I had the privilege of being perceived as cis because I hadn't started hormones or had any surgeries yet. I'm sorry, in what universe is being perceived as a cis person of your assigned gender when you're trans a privilege? That's the literal opposite of passing privilege, it's utter failure. But this kind of attitude is thrown at non-binary people all the time. We don't medically transition, so we're not actually trans, and therefore we have cis-passing privilege. And again, this assumes so much about us that is not actually true. It also implies that having cis-passing privilege makes you less queer and less welcome at Pride, which not only harms the non-binary people it's aimed at, but also catches a lot of binary trans men and women in the crossfire, because they can be perceived as cis too, either in the passing way as their true genders, or in the failing way as their assigned genders. Side note, this is why I hate the way we talk about passing in the first place, and why I find it extra awful that so many of the comments I've gotten about non-binary doesn't count because it's not visibly trans enough have come from other trans people. Seriously, what are y'all doing? For me, the worst thing about this whole bit of rhetoric is that multi-attracted people, a-spec people, and non-binary people are already some of the most widely misunderstood and least respected members of the queer community. That means we really need resources and pride events and connections with other queer people. So to see any queer person trying to take that away from another just because they might pass as cishet, I cannot emphasize enough how deeply hurtful and awful and despicable that is. So there we have it. 5 different examples of recycled bi, a, and enbyphobia. As you've hopefully gleaned from this video, these arguments are not logical. They're built on a foundation of incorrect assumptions and therefore full of holes. They're not helpful discourse or discussions worth having. They're just plain bigoted and hateful. And they're honestly pathetic because they show that people who hate us can't even come up with anything original to say, which is why I think we can fix this. If we recognize this rhetoric for what it is, recycled prejudice, then that gives us the power to stop it in its tracks. To say, hey, I've seen this before and I know it's BS. And that will help prevent it from getting recycled some more. So if you belong to one or more of the communities I've talked about in this video, and you have to endure all this recycled hate, please don't believe it or take it to heart. A lot of these arguments are framed in a way to make you think they're legitimate and internalize them. And I am begging you, don't. You are worth so much more than that. On that note, now is where I want to turn the conversation over to you. For my fellow people under the bi, a-spec, or non-binary umbrellas, which of these recycled pieces of hate is your least favorite? Do you have examples of any other ones I didn't mention? What do you do to push back against that kind of rhetoric when you see it? What questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. And I know this is a sensitive and potentially controversial topic, so if you could keep that discussion respectful, that would be great. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, pre- and post-testosterone voice recordings, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support. I hope your life is full of affirmations and free of recycled bigotry, and I will see you on the next one.